Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for joining me in this session. I realize a lot of you probably have lunch coming up, so I'll try to be as succinct and to the point as it can be. What I wanted to do for the next half hour is, first of all, talk about IBM's smarter computing strategy, and specifically how that strategy ties into cloud computing. And then I wanted to switch gears very quickly and talk about some specific solutions that we've recently enabled in the marketplace. One is called Foundation for Cloud, and the other one is called Starter Kit for Cloud. These are x86 solutions that are based on BladeCenter. So I also want to spend a few minutes just describing why BladeCenter has such a close affinity to virtualization and cloud, because a lot of the benefits that our customers are looking for from virtualization and cloud are actually at the hardware layer, also delivered in BladeCenter. So let's get going. So about 3 years ago, IBM introduced this concept of a smarter planet that is fueling innovation across industries and delivering new ways of living in terms of smarter cities, new business processes, and improving the way that we live in all aspects of our lives. As the world's systems become more instrumented, more interconnected, and fueled with intelligence, we're able to deliver new capabilities and new values to our customers. So everything's improving, from simple things like less congestion and less pollution in our cities to better ways of communicating and collaborating. New service delivery models are emerging, and we're getting new capabilities that we haven't seen in the last 10 years. Now, in order to support a smarter planet, the way that we run our IT infrastructures needs to change. With the increase in the number of workloads that we're deploying, the explosion of data that we have to manage, we can't continue to run with a lot of the inefficiencies that we see in our data centers. We still have 15% of servers are idle 24/7 all year. That's significant inefficiencies that can't support the demands that we have with a smarter planet. We need to think about new ways of architecting our IT in order to support these demands. And at the same time, a lot of organizations are putting a lot of pressure on the IT department, and IT budgets are not growing. So how do you support a growing number of workloads? How do you support more data? How do you support the increased levels of quality and delivery time of services that are now expected from your consumers? And how do you make sure that everything is secure? With more systems going online, there's a higher vulnerability that those systems are going to be compromised. And you only have to look at the headlines over the past 6 months to realize that security threats are very much relevant and penetrate all levels of organizations. So companies today are facing what we call a vicious cycle of IT. There are several challenges in the data center that are preventing us from delivering upon the value or the promise of value of a smarter planet. So first, in terms of sprawling IT, we continue to add more hardware to support new workloads. Every piece of equipment that we introduce into the data center requires more floor space, more power, more cooling, more testing, more management. All of this increases the cost of ownership. Now, once we've got that infrastructure in place, we're very reluctant to change that infrastructure. Changing the IT infrastructure introduces risks that a lot of businesses aren't willing to take on. So even though the business requirements may change over time, the IT infrastructure remains inflexible, and instead of changing it, we simply bring in more servers. At the same time, we've got an abundance of data. But a lot of that data is either incomplete, out of date, inconsistent, or oftentimes not unique. We want to harness that data to make decisions. But in order to do that, what do we need to do? We need to add more servers to run analytics so that we can harness that data. And oftentimes, it takes time, takes costs, and it delays a lot of the critical business decisions unnecessarily. So we have this vicious cycle of inefficiency in our data centers that we need to somehow resolve, and that is what smarter computing is about. Now, virtualization is no doubt one of the key components to addressing some of the inefficiencies. But virtualization alone is not the answer. You need more than just to virtualize. This graph just shows, over time, the number of virtual machines that are deployed each year and the number of physical systems that are deployed each year. The green bar shows VMs, the yellow bar shows physical systems, and the red bar are the physical hosts running those virtual machines. Now, the good news is we recently crossed the threshold where we're deploying more virtual machines each year than we are physical systems. So most companies today do have a standard that if you need to deploy a new workload for the line of business, that workload needs to reside on a virtual machine as the standard. If the line of business wants a dedicated server, it's an exception. Now, a couple of interesting things to note. If you look at the growth in server deployments over time, and if you take into account the global recession of 2008, 2009, the rate and pace that we're still deploying physical servers is actually not changed. So we're still adding more physical systems to our data centers. What's probably even more shocking is if you look at the rate and pace that we're deploying virtual machines, it's skyrocketing. It's a lot easier to add a VM than it is a physical system. So a lot of the challenges that we had in the late 90s and in the early part of the 2000 decade in terms of physical server sprawl has now been compounded. We still have physical server sprawl, but now we also have VM sprawl. So virtualization is part of the answer, but virtualization alone is insufficient. We need something more. So if you look at the challenges of trying to support a smarter planet, if you look at some of the economies that our IT leaders need to support in the data center with budgets not improving, we need to move to a new era of computing that we call smarter computing. In the 1960s, 1970s, with the mainframe era of computing, we saw huge gains in efficiencies, but those efficiencies were centered mostly on the back-end office applications and not readily available to most individuals. Over the past 3 decades, with distributed computing, we've put more of the power into the hands of the individuals, but it came at the cost of server sprawl and an increase in overall cost of ownership. So what we intend to do with smarter computing is try to combine and get the efficiencies that we saw in the mainframe era with the innovation and accessibility that we've seen in the last 3 decades with distributed computing. And that's what smarter computing is about. So there are 3 key capabilities in smarter computing. The first is around data, designed for data. How do we enable in real time organizations to leverage the abundance of data and make decisions quickly enough to actually get a first mover advantage? The second core capability is tuned to the task. How do we create systems that perform better and that are more efficient for the particular workload that we're trying to run on the system, and thereby lowering the cost for that workload? And then finally, probably most prevalent here, is managed in the cloud. How do we create a delivery model where if you want to deploy a new application, you can do so more rapidly? So instead of taking weeks to deploy and provision a new workload, it takes days or even hours. And then how do you create automation around that workload so you're not always having to administer every aspect of running that workload? So these are the 3 key capabilities of smarter computing. So switching gears a little bit, IBM in the cloud. IBM is not only obviously a cloud vendor, but we're actually a major consumer of cloud computing within our organization, at every aspect of our organization. So everything, for example, from our market intelligence groups, trying to gain insights from data, to our development organizations running dev and test labs, even to everyday tasks like creating web conferences. All of this is enabled, all the business processes and the technical requirements are enabled through cloud computing. So we are a huge consumer of cloud, and what we've done is we've taken our expertise and our experience in cloud computing to try to enable other organizations to gain the benefits by going to cloud computing. So we've built up a pretty strong resume. If you look even recently, last year, we had over 2,000 cloud-based engagements. We support 19 million public cloud users. We manage 1 million VMs, and 80% of Fortune 500 companies are using some sort of IBM cloud-based solution. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are two specific solutions that I want to talk about now. One is the foundation for cloud, and the other is starter kit for cloud. So if we can switch gears a little bit, first I want to talk about why BladeCenter. And I typically don't like talking about hardware first when we talk about a solution, but there has been such a close tie with virtualization and blades, and more recently, cloud deployments and blades, that I think it warrants just a few words. So first of all, why blades for virtualization and cloud? Well, first, in terms of efficiency. The blade infrastructure provides a great deal of hardware efficiencies by sharing resources. Whether those resources are the power and cooling infrastructure, networking, and even storage, you can gain a great deal of efficiency by not having to dedicate all those resources to each and individual server, but sharing it across multiple servers. Second, in terms of management, from a hardware perspective, a blade solution already has a central point of management to manage all the hardware. You don't have to log into each and every single server or every single network device. You can log into the central point of management and do basic provisioning functions. And then finally, in terms of deployment, if I want to deploy, redeploy, or even service a server, I don't have to go through the same effort that I would in a rack-based environment. I could simply take a new blade, slide it into the chassis if it has an open slot. The power connectors, network connectors are automatically there. I can even pre-provision LAN and SAN addresses, so it helps with provisioning the physical assets. So these three key benefits are very similar to why a lot of customers virtualize: gaining efficiency, better management, and then being able to deploy and redeploy new workloads faster. So why BladeCenter? So if you're going to go to a bladed architecture, there are a couple of reasons why you would consider moving to IBM BladeCenter. First, in terms of reliability, availability, and serviceability. If you're going to run multiple applications, multiple workloads on a single physical server, you want to make sure that that infrastructure is as robust as it can be. So BladeCenter has no single point of failure, so you can stay up and running longer and support more VMs. Second, it fits into the data center that you already own. We've got a wide array of options, from the chassis that go into a distributed enterprise, go into a large data center, even go on Navy ships. And you can choose the specific chassis and specific servers that meet your needs. And in terms of interoperability, it isn't a forklift replace. If you want to run BladeCenter and you have existing standards, whether that's on the networking side, on the storage side, you can still leverage BladeCenter and plug into that current investment that you have. And then finally, in terms of performance, we've invested unique development dollars in x86 to deliver capabilities that you don't get in other x86 servers. So for example, we launched X5, where we're able to scale memory, we're able to scale processors, run higher speed processors, and get more work done for the dollar by providing higher levels of performance.